Alan just will not give up. And if I do say so myself, these third and fourth days of our journey's leg 4 are not the worst that we've done.
Well, I think that was my best night's sleep so far. Let's see what the weather's like outside.
We left off last time in search of a good night's sleep, floating around 100 yards or so off the shoreline of Lindisfarne on the historic Northumbrian coastline. Tidal streams here can cause anchored boats to drag or come loose, but we'd stayed put. Well done, Alan's anchor chain. And this is what we need to do today. From our secluded natural harbour, further up the northeast coast, completing Alan's first border crossing from England to Scottish waters, and then around into the Firth of Forth to a boatyard west of the capital, Edinburgh.
Welcome to Holy Island at 0630, and there's going to be a little bit of a westerly coming in today, but to be honest it's supposed to already be here, but the land is blocking it rather nicely.
Dedicated Alaners are probably already up to date that we're not crossing to Norway this year. Check the previous episodes for an explanation, but you did probably think that we were headed to the Aberdeenshire coast this month. The idea being that as soon as weather allows next spring, we'd be in a good position to head across the North Sea via the Shetland Islands and make up all the lost time. But the northeast coast of Scotland has very, very few marinas, or yards with facilities to lift out small boats. There are plenty of fishing harbours, but they just aren't set up to cater for the leisure boat market aside from overnight visitor moorings. I thought I'd found a solution at Peterhead, a short distance from Aberdeen, and positioned well for me to fly back and forth from London. But no. Email comms with the marina were very, very slow, and their content was confusing, and didn't seem to match the website. So, with red flags waving, instead I got permission to head to Port Edgar, near Edinburgh. Not as far north as I'd like, but the options really are few. Even here I needed to plead our case, as there seems to be a bit of lifeboat phobia in some marinas. Let's do that then. Setting off from anchor was going to be even easier than on our arrival, as half the fishing boats had disappeared before sunrise, presumably to take advantage of the good weather that's eluded our east coast for so much of these summer months. Look, the white LED all-round light that we use at anchor is working like a champion. However, this idyllic scene wasn't to last, and we knew that we were perfectly protected here from what was building after the change of wind direction that night. No more raiding parties on Holy Island, and time to reclaim our anchor. I'm still learning when it comes to anchor technique. In fact, on the original Dark Ice project, we expected to perhaps never anchor at all, so we're planning to do so without any form of deck hardware to support it. In particular, I'm trying to get the balance right on chain and rope length deployed. Too little and we might drag at high tide. Too much and we might swing around at low tide in too large a circle, colliding with sandbars or other boats and so on. So far, no disasters. The mill pond stayed with us, and we stuck to the normal morning configuration. Me servicing the anchor, Tarek at the bow with me checking the chain and rope fed incorrectly, and Louis at the controls. As if to commiserate with the notable lack of exotic wildlife on the last leg as we toured the Farne Islands, a chunky-sized seal gave my footage of Lindisfarne Castle some foreground interest. And, probably wondering what on earth this bright orange thing was doing in his water, I say his. I do think this was a bull seal, but may be wrong. I have been known to be once or twice. More castle, more sunrise, more flattish water. Excellent. And even more castle. And you can make out the ruined priory in the distance. We even came across the early bird fishing boats as they did their thing. Alternating between taking in the scenic coastline and doing all the usual checks on the anchor system and strap down fenders, I did need to think about our day plan. Unlike previous days, we didn't really have a target harbour or anchorage. The wind was going to make the decision for us, as the forecast direction and strength kept changing. I suspected we'd anchor once again, as once past Eyemouth, options are cramped, crowded and tricky to navigate for a boat like Alan. A moment though to check on the engine bay temperature, which is behaving itself, and swiftly moving past the morning's pancakes, back to the engine bay air extraction system. I think the two fans for the two upper bays are balanced well, not fighting each other, but I'm going to add a metal structure around the vertical pipe. Firstly to stop the temptation to use it as a handhold, but also so that wet rags and clothes can be dried out around the warm duct. I don't know if I've yet showed you the silicone duct elbow out the stern end, and of course checking the dinghy's new damped double tow line. Right, I've been going on about the wind. No dramatic red or purple colours going on this time, and we have westerly going on. Generally, this is good news on the North Sea coast, especially if it's been going on a while, as there's unlikely to be competing swell from another direction. However, we were hoping for a forecast change to a northerly the next day, as we turned west into the Firth of Forth. Sadly, that evaporated, and we ended up with a moderate westerly forecast. This area of inlet is wide enough for waves to grow if you have a westerly funneling along it. Anyhow, we'll take each day as it presents itself. We emerged from the protection of Holy Island and the exposed sandbanks around it, and found the wind from the west had been at work. Pretty soon we had some short, breaking wind waves, as we were a few miles offshore and not able to take advantage of the protection of land. We were not heading to Berwick-upon-Tweed, one of the final English coastal towns we'd pass, but decided to change our heading to hug the coast a bit more. Generally, we find that with Alan, we can make better headway if within a mile or so of shore when there's a substantial offshore wind. We got exactly the desired result, and ended up back to a roughly 6-knot pace, perhaps a little higher. Due to Alan's freeboard being large when you take into account the ratio to his length, people assume that we're totally at the mercy of adverse winds, and will end up being pushed around or even stopped. I don't find this to be the case, except when trying to manoeuvre in marinas in gusty winds. It's generally short, steep waves that irritate Alan. I've also been thinking about the side hatch situation. We usually have one open, as both open can generate a strong draft, or slam the doors. This means crew can help keep watch, enjoy seeing the world go by, but, importantly, not feel sick if there's any rocking around. There will be times when this isn't going to work though, in genuinely nasty seas, or if our angle of attack is causing waves to break and splash through the hatch and soak us. The hatch doors are not structural, so I may well relent to the request for some new windows. They're going to end up pretty salty, but that's half the fun of it, I suppose. Such riveting thoughts nearly distracted me from a major event, the border crossing. Alan is now in Scottish waters, and no one, at least initially, seems too cross about that. So we carried on past the charming, if a little precariously positioned, village of Bournemouth. The local fishing boats were sticking close to shore too, but that's probably more due to what they were busy trying to collect from under the water than any suggestion that they're copying Alan's tactic for finding flatter water. At this point, and in fact at the very moment Louis was on the stern platform getting some fresh air, we were intercepted by an unknown flying object. This wasn't pre-planned, but we didn't perceive it to be an immediate threat to Alan or his crew. As a result, we opted not to deploy countermeasures, but just to keep an eye on the craft, keeping an eye on us. The multiple circlings and passes continued as we motored on by Eyemouth, which by the way has a very helpful and conscientious harbour master. I reasoned that our interceptor would run out of fuel eventually and have to return to shore. As you'll probably deduce from the fact that you're looking at the footage, a very nice bloke got in touch via social media and offered the video files for us to use. He's also a volunteer on the local RNLI lifeboat and had apparently tracked Alan's progress using AIS pings. Eyemouth was soon in Alan's rear view mirror, or would have been if Alan had one, and next we had the natural wonderment of St Abb's Head in front of us. It's a very smart expanse of cliffs and rocky outcrops, and again should have been absolutely seething with seabirds. Again though, whilst not deserted, the lack of bird life was rather sad. For those of you living empty, unfulfilled lives due to not having watched part 1 of this brace of Leg 4 episodes, I touched upon the recent avian flu outbreak, which has apparently been the major cause. I would have collected better footage with the long-distance camera, but I was at the controls and both crew were napping, so I did my best with my phone camera. This was also the scene of the wind change. The northerly swing, that same one forecast for the next day as we planned to turn west and pass Edinburgh, had come a day early, and so we now had a growing wind on our bow coming down from the open sea between Norway and Scotland. So, back to thump, thump, thump on the bow, and with wind waves, swell and a light current against us, Alan's mighty turbocharged 48 horses was able to push us on at only about 2 knots. You can see in this sped up footage the smaller wind waves and the longer swell waves, although this was shot a little earlier before the wind speed increased. By the way, when they say the East Coast Mainline Railway, they really do mean it. A few steps to the east and it would become rather wet. There were a few more landmarks to enjoy out of the portside hatch, although our slowing pace had sparked a new planning session to look for alternative options should we not reach where we intended. This is the Torness nuclear power station. Unsurprisingly, the water directly adjacent is a restricted zone, but we didn't need to pass much nearer, save I guess if we wanted to have a swim in warmer water. Then the radio crackled into life.
Roger, thank you.
There's been a lifeboat call out in the area just south of where we are. There had been a Mayday call, but given our location, we were only getting one half of the conversation from the strong Coast Guard land station transmitters.
Wind cut, please go to channel 67 and stand by, over.
We worked out that it was going on near Eyemouth, hours away from us now, so any sense that we may be of assistance was replaced with anxious hope that the authorities could act fast enough.
Hello, this is Aberdeen Coast Guard. Are you alone in the boat? Over. This is Aberdeen Coast Guard. Can you describe your boat? Over.
I think the actual boat in distress is out of our range.
Yeah. I thought I could hear a voice for a second. I could hear it.
This is Shetland Coast Guard, sir. Do you have any mobile number? Over.
They were having a real drama working out where the distressed boat was, and I was trying to work out whether it was the victim or a nearby skipper that was speaking with the Coast Guard.
Can you see the vessel in trouble? Over. This is Aberdeen Coast Guard. Say again, over.
It's someone reporting distress, not the person in distress.
The lifeboat has been tasked. They are going to help you. Over.
It sounds like...
Can you say your position? Over.
From what I...
Position north, south of Eyemouth. Over.
As it happened, I found out more from my new link at the Eyemouth RNLI, who deployed one of their new fast coastal boats. They had to use a radio direction finder on the lifeboat. I don't want to overshare sensitive info, but it turned out the solo sailor was plucked from the sea having been in the water for over half an hour and did recover in hospital. So, for those of you cowardly anonymous know-it-alls in the comments being dismissive about the sea state in the Leg 3 episode, this is what can happen even when it's not a Force 8 with 3-metre waves. Back to Alan's stoic efforts. We'd just caught sight of the world-famous Bass Rock, a giant landmark off the East Lothian coast, and it indicated where we'd really turned the corner directly west into the mouth of the Forth. We passed the town of Dunbar, which aside from emergencies I'd totally written off as a potential overnight stopover. The harbour there is undeniably spectacular, and indeed with a fascinating history, but there's no way in hell I could manoeuvre and moor Alan in there. That reflects on me, not on Alan. With biggish waves like this, I'm checking on Alan so regularly. Still there? I was also looking at the new forecasts, as there was going to be an evening peak in the wind. If we carried on past North Berwick that afternoon, we'd end up on a coastline section with zero shelter from the growing wind and waves, and bereft of safe anchorages or harbours. I decided, before it was too late and we ran out of east-facing beaches, to pick one that I reasoned gave us the best chance of a night's sleep, but far enough along so we didn't have too much to do the next day. This is about the only reasonably sheltered beach facing to the east, which is what we need to protect ourselves from the easterly wind, and so we're going to head to it now, and hopefully we'll be able to find an area where the waves aren't being able to give it a chance to build. Okay, so Louis is just making the wheel fast so that we don't get lots of side-to-side swagger, and my two buckets appear to be working alright. I think one of them's disappeared off that way, one of them's over there. They appear to be doing some good, which I'm delighted about, and I reckon we can switch off so you can actually hear me, because we're holding station on the updated anchor position really well. As far as I could tell, it had a fairly normal name, although the forecasting apps were convinced it was called this. Either way, it was a beach, although a very shallow one. We anchored in enough water to keep us afloat at low tide, but that meant being nearly 200 yards offshore at high tide. Problem? Yes, it meant waves that rocked us about, as the wind was gusting towards 30 knots and kept changing direction. I tried a couple of buckets to keep us from swinging left and right, which was causing the rolling, but there was no tide to speak of, so instead our solution was to head further inshore. We picked a spot on the chart and did quick calculations with the tide times and heights, and motored carefully much closer to the waterline. As you'll have gathered, we made a decision. The sand was totally clear of rocks and other obstructions, so I decided it was safe to dry out. Alan has sat on muddy creek beds plenty in the past without incurring damage, but this would be a first on sand, and a first time with waves. They pulled us side on to the shore as we tapped the bottom and then finally settled on the sand. On the shopping list is a small stern anchor and chain, which we could have used to keep us bow on to the wind and waves, so avoiding the discomfort of excessive rolling and tapping bottom. We'd go ashore for a leg stretch, but needed to wait until the tide retreated fully past Alan. We passed the time watching gannets dive-bombing the sea in their extraordinary showcase of fishing skill. Most will probably nest on Bass Rock, but there are smaller colonies along the cliffs too. We stepped ashore from Alan. I won't lie, while short of being alarmed, I was very keen to watch how Alan settled on the sand, as with any new experience, kept thinking of actions to take if anything went wrong, like a heavy list to one side or another. But to be honest, we were somewhat committed now. It's not like we could fire Alan back up and park elsewhere. It did also give me a chance for a quick running repair. I had noticed the rudder extension had gone slightly floppy. The steering had not been affected, but a diagnosis was needed, of course. It turned out that the one set of bolts I had not replaced from the original configuration, that had used basic spring washers, had loosened. Viewers of this channel will know from the early days that we have a ban on the use of spring washers, as they simply do not stop nuts from loosening. Quite why they are used so universally baffles me. Do they have a redeeming feature that I'm unaware of? We went for a walk, tried to escape the millions of sandflies that plagued the dunes, and then noticed a couple of high-vis clad characters walking towards us, having clearly taken an interest in Alan, sat proudly, or perhaps in a state of bemusement, on the sand. They were from a Coast Guard patrol. Although they had tracked us on AIS and so knew that we were a registered pleasure vessel and not an in-service lifeboat, apparently a call from the public about us beaching meant that they thought they'd pass by and check all was well. All was, and so we had a chat, shared my YouTube channel link, and took a fun photo. We decided not to sleep in this position, as we needed to set off early in the morning, and it would be low tide again then. So we hopped aboard and waited to refloat.
We're trying to work out whether it's okay for us to turn on the engine and get going and move to our anchorage, because the water is now at the weed line. That's good news. And we just need to make sure that the rudder skeg is free of sand, and then we can get cracking. We're waiting to float. Hi Derek. Hey Louis.
Hey,
Waiting to float. It's a beautiful evening. It's now a lot less wind than there was before. There's Alanson the third.
This was a little less bumpy than the drying out. Does anyone have any tips about how to beach a boat whilst minimising the tapping on the keel? The keel itself is rock solid, but I may not be so lucky in future with the rudder assembly and the keel cooler. We motored off a few dozen yards, re-anchored and slept. Once again, no need to illustrate, but the impact it had on my hair you can see.
So we've got a bit of a roll here, about half an hour before we were aiming to get up, but the boat settled not particularly comfortably on this, luckily not very rolly tide, but anyway, I think it's probably time for us to get cracking, and we can get some extra shut-eye along the way whilst people are taking shifts at the wheel.
It was also a masterful anchoring effort. Alan stayed almost perfectly on station all night long, never getting even remotely close to the anchor watch alarm radius we set each night. But, cut to 20 minutes later.
Alex, do you want to give us an update on what's just happened?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're all alive. Yeah, we must have accidentally backed onto Alanson the third, and the rope got caught around our prop, and we stopped before we started using the prop, the rope cutter. Anyway, so because we were drifting with the wind, well, sorry, not with the wind, with the waves actually, sorry, with the swell, we were being slowly pushed back towards the beach again. We went into, well, I'll say a state of alertness. Got the rope cut, original rope stand pieces, and we've now created a new rope using thinner rope, but I then put on a double backup, so I don't think we'll have any problems keeping Alison with us. Anyway, that was a way to wake up. You don't need a coffee, do you?
No, I'm good.
Yeah, but look, we're underway, nothing's broken, apart from a bit of rope, and me.
We decided that was quite enough drama for the day, our final day in fact, so motored out of the bay, between the Bass Rock, North Berwick the nearby town, and a collection of other small islands. I've never landed on the rock itself, despite going on a boat tour there years ago, as you need perfect conditions on the stone jetty to safely get on and off. More castles, more fishermen, lots and lots and lots of fishing pot marker buoys to weave between. Then, we emerged from behind the final island that was at least partly protecting our zone of water from the waves accruing from the west. The waves never grew truly large, but it was like they'd been designed for maximum irritation for our boat length and speed. They came at us from ahead, but also partly from the north, two sets of wave types. They were short, and for want of a better descriptor, thumpy. Alan's bow kept taking irregular thwacks, some of which induced a roll that put us off balance for the next one that rolled in rather unpredictably. The next 3 or 4 hours were rather uncomfortable, and we all took turns at the helm. In case you're commenting on the windscreen again, yes, the droplets are a little distracting despite the beading compound I've applied, but the camera was focusing on them, so in reality we could see pretty well. I'm considering various methods for clearing that window, but most mechanical wiping methods have as many cons as pros going for them. Qualified advice welcomed. There are a number of islands peppering the Firth of Forth, most homes to ruins of military defences spanning a number of centuries, but also old abbeys and prisons. So we passed by those and said a brief hello to Edinburgh on our port side. Thankfully, as the inlet narrowed, the waves lacked space to grow, and in a half-hour period, they settled.
So hopefully you can see the bridges behind me. It's like we're in an altogether different world now than just half an hour ago when we were out in the wider part of the Firth of Forth. It's now super calm, I can be up here, but before it was really throwing us around quite a bit. Very awkward sea.
Alan now had just a couple of hours of motoring left to complete this summer's travel. Yes, I know I've moved the goalposts twice, and quite substantially, but I've been playing the cards I've been dealt. I'm proud of Alan. Don't tell him, but he hasn't really put a keel or a mast or any other item of anatomy wrong. Any mistakes have been down to me. We were actually ahead of the time slot for the boat lift I'd booked at the marina, so we cut the revs and completed a sedate 5-mile ceremonial victory parade just south of the shipping channels. There was a large cruise ship at anchor, and before I could see that they were busy shuttling passengers to and from shore, I checked on the radio that they weren't about to march stridently across our bow.
I'm just checking that it's okay to pass in front of the pt2 liner.
Alan, standby. Alan, Forth navigation. This is Hibbert. Those tenders running from the cruise ship to Haven Harbour.
Understood. We will pass with PK in front of the pt2 liner and head to Queensbury.
In fact, the ship was adorned with Alan's yellow cousins. Most were emergency lifeboats, but a few were catamaran tenders used to move passengers from ship to port and vice versa. They were busy doing all manner of shuttling as we passed. We passed a buoy that, according to the tourist literature, was supposed to have a seal sunbathing on it, and rather disappointed, continued on to greet a large tanker moored at one of the terminals. Of course, a tip of the cap to Alan's cousin, of a less usual design, precariously slung onto the ship's side. Then, to where the 3 huge bridges span the Forth from south to north Queensbury, spanning north to south too, but you probably got there yourselves. We approached the marina and made sure that we didn't smack into the east-west breakwater. Imagine running aground only 100 yards from the finish line, and in fact, in front of dozens of tourists. What tourists, I hear you cry? Well, all the ones aboard that tripper boat, whose clown of a skipper decided to ignore the fact a boat approaching from behind does not have right of way, steamed at speed across our bow, and forced us to change mooring location at the last moment. We roped up to the fuel berth, went to the marina office to confirm that we were on for a lift, and then backed up to head for the hoist. I categorically did not bump gently into one of the hoist's fenders as I overcompensated for the side wind, thinking I was being clever in doing so. But we were successfully captured, slings placed, and hoiked out the water by the really friendly yard team. Once ashore, it turned out that we had picked up an uninvited passenger on the final day, although we didn't notice any issues with speed or steering. It turns out there's something owners of all-in-one prop shaft anodes and rope cutters should know. As the zinc corrodes, the locking bolts loosen a little. This might not stop the anode working, but it sure as hell stops the rope cutter cutting rope, something to keep an eye on and retighten on a schedule. I also took a closer look at the wobbly rudder extension bracket. I'm going to totally redesign it with a large 316 stainless bracket. And you may have noticed the fouling, mostly little barnacles that have clung on and survived the jet washing. You'll recall I decided a while back to go for a super tough epoxy below the waterline paint, instead of anti-foul silicone paint or copper coat. The idea being to lift out of the water periodically to clean, sand and recoat. It's a cheap, easy maintenance strategy, and besides, practically all this growth happened in the Grimsby fish stocks where the water was teeming with barnacle food. Even copper coat needs a buff back once a year, so no system is maintenance free. Alan then gave his orders about where he'd like to be parked for the dark season, and the yard team duly relented to his requirements. I love the fact how Alan tries to look all dignified and in control when he's slung in the air and being driven about. I think he thinks it's like being in a sedan chair. We can indulge Alan's delusions. Less drama that way. Of course, Alan's steel cradle was cut up and scrapped back in June, and is probably now melted down and recast into something deeply useful. None of the yacht cradles in the marina fit Alan's weird hull, so railway sleepers and blocks it is, which is fine by me. And we have such a wonderful view out over the water, and of the bridges. Yes, in a strong northerly wind Alan will get a salty shower, but that's nothing a good rainstorm won't rinse off. if only Scotland was famous for its rainfall. I'm going to round off with a mercifully brief cheers to those of you who have helped us along this summer with memberships, donations for fuel and marinas, and views. This marina stay and all the travelling up and down will be a major drain on my budget, so any continuing contribution is grudgingly appreciated by Alan. I will continue to modify and update the boat inside and out, do not fear, and as you've seen on the community page, I'm looking to run some live events across the UK. Interest seems strong, so watch out for updates and keep your diaries flexible for the autumn and winter if you're roughly nearby. Louis, Tarek and I headed home via the majestic Edinburgh, hearts full of pride for getting Alan through his final sea leg of 2023, and without any international incidents, lawsuits or scandals. I can't promise that'll continue. Right, that's it. Bye.